and jump in just to be respectful of everyone's time. I see people are starting to filter into the room, and so we'll go ahead and do the introductory parts so that we can take advantage of our full time because we do have a packed hour full of information for you today. So welcome to Policies, Practices, and Perspectives, examining district guidance and equity implications related to students' use of facilities as it relates to gender. My name is Quentin Stroud. I am the Equity Policy Analyst working in the Center for Equity and Social Justice. Today, I'll be joined by my colleague, Deirdre Lynch-Smith, who is the Organizational Ombuds, as we take you through some background related to gender and facilities usage in the district, as well as guidance that is out nationally.
So good afternoon, everyone. As Quentin said, welcome to our session. I'm Deirdre Lynch-Smith, the Organizational Ombuds. Quentin and I comprise the Organizational Ombuds office, and our office is situated within the Center for Equity and Social Justice. We are tasked with examining district policies and protocols, as well as stakeholder concerns and engagement to ensure that we are creating just and equitable conditions for all stakeholders, whether those are employees, community members, students, or parents. So our objectives for this afternoon, as we talk about gender use and facilities, gender use and facilities is a hot topic within APS, and it's an area that Quentin and I have spent much of the last almost year delving into to better understand and to analyze and lay out policies and protocols, as well as recommendations in conjunction with the CESJ for our staff and leaders within the district. So we'll start off by looking at current and reviewing current gender restroom and facilities use policies that have been established with the district. We'll delve a little bit in this afternoon to federal, state, and policy guidance, as well as some legal cases that have set the tone for gender use and facilities discussions nationwide. And we'll also be examining recommendations that were developed by our own internal APS LGBTQIA task force. And then we'll circle back around to share some equity-focused recommendations for gender use and facilities, but specifically what our goals are for this session are to allow you to lean in and to analyze some of the topics, policies, and procedures that we're going to be sharing out. So we will have a group breakout time, and then we'll reconvene for any opportunities for the groups to share out key and critical points that you develop. And then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So as Quentin mentioned, we have an action-packed session, and so we appreciate your engagement and are really looking forward to the opportunity to discuss collaboratively this critical topic. So in grounding ourselves for today, let's have a little bit of an interactive scenario. So I'd like for you to just use your imagination. You're a 12-year-old student and you're sitting in your middle school social studies class right after lunch when you realize that you need to use the restroom. What do you do next? And I'd like for you to place your answer in the chat. Do you A, raise your hand and ask the teacher for use to use permission? B, do you decide to hold off on going to the restroom and wait until the class change for the next period? Or C, nothing. You are confused about the rules for your use of the restroom at your school. So I see a lot of A's, lots of A's coming through. Raising your hand and just asking the teacher for permission. I see B, asking to hold off. Lots of A's and B's. Okay, perfect. So everybody's weighing in. Thank you for sharing that. So the majority of our respondents are saying that you would just raise your hand and ask the teacher for permission to use the restroom. So let's move on to our next slide. So now I'd like for you to shift hats. Imagine that you are a transgender student, a non-binary student, or a student who is undergoing a gender transition. How might your experience differ if you are a student who is trying to determine which identity they identify with from terms of gender, or you are currently identifying as a transgender student? So share that response in the chat if you don't mind. So I see some C's. You might hold off. You might hold off and because you're confused about the policy. I see a few A's. Some people might raise their hand and they feel comfortable with asking to go to the restroom. I see a couple of B's that they might wait between the class change. So there's a variety of responses here, but the large majority to this majority of answers to this question are C. You might experience some confusion about the policies related to restroom use. So let's look at what students actually may be feeling, and actually some of you all as educational leaders in the space. So in working with transgender students or identifying as a student who's non-binary or transitioning, there may be feelings of anxiety when it comes to determining which facilities to use. There may be feelings of fear. Some students might have a little bit of fear or maybe a lot of fear and anxiety related to asking to use the restroom, or even thinking about the fact that their parents, even though they identify by one gender at school, their parents at home may not understand that they desire to transition or identify themselves as non-binary. So there may be a sense of panic. And overall, potentially there might be feelings of frustration or the policy or lack of knowledge about the actual concrete policies related to gender might create some frustration for students. And we know, based upon our interaction with APS leaders this year, that there's sometimes some frustration from the perspective of leaders in understanding exactly where the district weighs in. So I'd like to thank you for just taking a time to participate in the scenario. And I'm going to turn it over to Quentin to share a little bit more about the experiences of transgender and non-binary students.
Thank you so much, Deirdre. And so, yes, just a closer look at some of the statistics and data related to the experiences of transgender and non-binary students in schools. So currently, there are approximately 1.3 million youth who identify as transgender. And according to a 2019 study by the CDC, approximately 2% of high school students nationwide identify as transgender. In a recent study conducted by GLSEN in 2019, they found that 25% of those, 75%, sorry, of those transgender youth who are in schools feel unsafe in their school environments. And 80% of students reported that they avoided the restrooms in particular because they felt safe or uncomfortable in those spaces. And lastly, 59% of transgender students reported that they were required to use restroom facilities at school that did not actually align with their lived gender identity. So on the national education landscape, gender and school facilities, just a recap of some of the recent research and some reports that are highlighting some high-level trends related to students' ability to navigate facilities usage in schools. So in education in a pandemic, the disparate impacts of COVID-19 on America's students. This June 2021 report released by the U.S. Department of Education highlighted some of the disparate impacts COVID-19 has had on students, including some of the challenges that LGBTQIA+ students have faced both before and during the pandemic. And in the pre-pandemic report findings, in a report titled Harms from Unequal Access to Restrooms, many transgender students who were excluded from school restrooms that aligned with their gender identity actually avoided using the restroom while at school, which in some cases led to students experiencing serious medical complications and other sorts of harm. Next, so as we talk about state policies and guidance for LGBTQIA+ facilities, in Georgia, there are currently no anti-LGBT+ school laws or regulations. 21 states and the District of Columbia have actually passed anti-harassment and bullying legislation to ensure that there are protections for students in K-12 settings based on their perceived or actual gender identities. And in Michigan, and these last two are a few important resources. So there in Michigan, the Organization on Adolescent Sexual Health has created an LGBTQ youth inclusivity toolkit, and GLSEN, which is an LGBTQ education and advocacy organization, has also produced a safe space toolkit for LGBTQIA youth.
So Quentin, thanks so much for sharing a little bit more about where Georgia stacks up. But what we want to do, one of the things that we have the opportunity to do is to really look at how policy impacts the decisions we make here within the district. And a great starting point for that is to really look at the legal landscape and the landscape of decisions that have come down from our appellate courts as well as the Supreme Court on issues that impact gender and facilities. And what you see here is actually a seesaw draw in the middle, because where we are is that there have been appellate court cases all around the country that ultimately have made some decisions in favor of gender use by transgender students with the restrooms and facilities for the identity for which they identify. But then there have been other decisions that potentially have a disparate or negative impact on students who identify as transitioning, non-binary, or transgender. And so at the top right, you see Gerald Bostic. He actually is the recent plaintiff in a Supreme Court case, Bostic versus Clayton County, which is right down the road here in Clayton County, Georgia. Gerald's case was heard in 2020 by the Supreme Court, and it's really set the tone for some things that we'll be discussing momentarily about gender and overall gender identity rights as they impact students. And then what you see on the bottom left hand corner is Andrew Adams. Andrew is a plaintiff in a K-12 case, Adams versus a school board in Florida. And we'll talk a little bit more about the implications of the decision by the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in Andrew's case. And then, of course, you see the Supreme Court and how they, at this point, will potentially be hearing Andrew's case and others like it if they elevate to the Supreme Court level. So let's just jump right in and talk about the cases around the country and how this hot topic of gender use in facilities is playing out in states and different regions. So there have been some recent federal court decisions that have examined the rights of students to have access to facilities. And so one of the most recent decisions in 2020 for the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, and the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals is the Court of Appeals that has regional jurisdiction in states like North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland. So I want you to think about that area of the country when we think about what the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals has said and how it's playing out in that area, which is actually like our adjacent next door neighbor regional area of states. So in Grimm versus Gloucester County Board of Education, the appellate court said that Title IX, which is the federal protection against gender discrimination, and the US Constitution protects transgendered students from being excluded from common restrooms that align with their gender identity. And so as Quentin mentioned earlier, that includes their lived gender identity. So this is a win. This has been a win for transgender students in that regional area, because in the end, they're using the double prong of Title IX as a federal education protection and the Constitution to protect the right of transgender students. But then the next case, which comes to us from the Ninth Circuit. So when we think about the Ninth Circuit, we really want to think about the West Coast. So we're looking at parts of California, Arizona, Nevada, Oregon, and Washington State. So in that area of the country, there was a group of parents who filed a complaint with their district court, elevated up to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And in that case, the court again ruled in favor of transgender students. So the parents alleged that policies that have permitted transgendered students from using restroom facilities and school facilities violated the rights of students who were non-transgender, or as we call them, cisgendered students. And the court said, no, not actually the case. A school district's transgender inclusive policies are actually not a violation of the rights of non-transgender students, thus giving students who are transgender access to facilities. So that's in the Ninth Circuit. Then I want you to think a little bit about this next case, Doe via Boyertown Area School District. That came to us in 2018. So it's an earlier case, but from the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. And that actually is a Court of Appeals that is up in the area of Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey. So we're talking about Northeast United States, northeastern area of our country. And so in that case, the Third District Circuit Court of Appeals said that allowing transgender students to use their preferred sex segregated spaces. So if they want to use the gender, the bathroom for which they identify with based on gender, it's not a violation of the rights of non-transgendered students. So we see a common through line here of courts of appeals in the Fourth, Ninth, and Third Circuits all elevating the rights, educational rights, and access of transgendered students to the restrooms for which they identify with by gender. But let's look a little bit at that seesaw effect as we talk about the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. And so the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals is actually the Court of Appeals. It's actually situated right here in Georgia. The 11th Circuit Court is housed here in Atlanta. The 11th Circuit has jurisdiction regionally over Alabama, Georgia, and parts of Florida. And so in this case, Adams, this is the young man that I showed in the earlier slide, Adams versus the School Board of St. Johns County, Florida. In this case, Andrew Adams was a male student. He had been identifying and living as a male student for several years. He had regularly been using the boys' restroom when he started out in his freshman year in school, at high school, but someone anonymously reported that Andrew was a transgender student and had been using the boys' restroom, at which time the school district or the school said that he needed to use a separate unisex restroom just to ensure that he wouldn't be a threat to other students who were non-transgender. And so at that point, Andrew and his family, they filed a complaint, and they said that ultimately by separating Andrew from use of facilities, the restroom for which he identified as a boy, he identified as a male student, that it ultimately made him unfit and infringed upon his rights, his equal protection rights under the Constitution, as well as his Title IX rights to share communal schools and communal facilities with other students. So in 2020, there was a 3-judge panel. So it was a more limited panel of the Court of Appeals. They ruled that schools must treat transgender students equally in restrooms, and that failure to do so was deemed a violation of the equal protection rights. Now, what the court didn't rule on in 2020 was they didn't touch the Title IX rights. And this is critical because in reality, the school district, based upon the court initially ruling in favor of Andrew and his use of facilities as a transgender student, the school district appealed. And in August of 21, just this past August, the 11th Circuit Court, they vacated their opinion. It was actually a 2-to-1 opinion with the more limited panel. And the school district appealed, asking for what's called an en-banc hearing. So that means instead of hearing just from those 3 judges on that initial panel, they wanted to hear from all 12 members of the court. So currently this case is up for appeal, and there is the potential that the 11th Circuit Court will rule in a way that is much different than the courts from other circuits around the country. And ultimately they could reverse this, and it could have a disparate impact on transgender students. But Quentin and I wanted to share this out today because it's very critical as we think about the way that APS, that we adhere to policies. It's very critical for us to understand the legal shift and the way that legally these issues related to LGBTQIA youth and their rights as students are being considered by courts around the country, particularly here in the 11th Circuit. So I mentioned earlier in that first case, Grimm v. Gloucester County, the importance of Title IX. And so I'm sure that many of you, all of you have heard of Title IX. We, many instances, hear about Title IX in relation to facilities use based upon gender, male and female, for sports, and ensuring that female sports teams have access to the same resources and facilities as male sports teams. But when we unpack Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972 is the federal law that prohibits sex discrimination in education. And Title IX is applicable to any K-12 school district, preschool, college, or university that receives federal funding. So this is critical to APS in our delivery of services to students, because we are bound by the federal education amendments based upon the fact that we receive the federal funding. So Title IX also provides protections for transgender and non-binary students. And some of these protections include requiring that school districts treat transgender and non-binary students based upon their gender identity, or as Quentin said earlier, their lived gender identity. and ensuring that transgender and non-binary students have access to restrooms, locker rooms, and facilities that are aligned with their gender identity, and requiring our school district and school districts around the country to use the name and pronoun preferences of the transgender student. So that means that if a student desires to be called by a she or a he pronoun, that we are respecting their right and that we are ensuring that they are referred to by their desired pronoun. And then last but not least, that school districts allow transgender students to dress in accordance with their preferred gender identity. And so let's talk about the federal guidance. And I mentioned earlier Gerald Bostick and the Clayton County case and how it elevated all the way to the Supreme Court. In Bostick v. Clayton County, Gerald Bostick was fired from his role as a Clayton County government employee, and he alleged that he was fired because of his identification as a gay male. And so the Supreme Court in this decision, even though Bostick was an adult employment case, the Supreme Court held that it is impossible to discriminate against a person because of their sexual orientation or gender identity without also discriminating against that individual based upon their sex. So again, Bostick versus Clayton County is an adult case related to a workplace matter. However, by the Supreme Court stating that you can't discriminate against an individual based upon their sexual orientation or gender identity without discriminating against that individual based on sex, it actually triggers Title IX protections, because we know that Title IX is the educational amendment that protects against discrimination based on sex. So the U.S. Department of Education in June of last year, they released guidance to educators and school districts that ultimately said that even though there isn't a Supreme Court case that has yet been decided related to students and the workplace, that they are extending at the federal level through the Department of Education's guidance that Bostick and the court's interpretation of Bostick, court's ruling in Bostick, can be interpreted as a Title IX violation. So that regardless of if an individual is an adult or a student in school, any discrimination against that individual based upon their gender identity or their sexual orientation is in fact a violation of Title IX. So that's a lot to consider, a lot to unpack, but we're here to work together so that you all have a better understanding, and we're happy to answer questions as we move forward. What I want to share now is where APS weighs in, because a lot of people are like, well, probably we've gotten all this information about court cases, but where exactly does APS weigh into these decisions and what are our policies? So our recent guidance, and this is a little bit of a timeline. So if we go back to 2016, Erica Long, our senior policy advisor and governmental affairs advisor, in information that the district shared out with stakeholders in 2016, Erica released a statement on behalf of the district that students are entitled to an equal educational opportunities regardless of their race, color, gender identity, or expression. So our district interpretation of this through our equal educational opportunities policy is that transgender students are allowed to use the restroom that conforms with their gender, it corresponds with their gender identity. And if a transgender student would like, this is based on their preference only, that they can also be provided with a private keyed restroom if that's their preference. However, we cannot require a student to use a separate facility from their preferred gender identity, their lived gender identity. So then in 2017, there was a little bit of regression at the federal level. President Trump, under his administration, there was a withdrawal of federal protections for transgender students. And so this proved problematic because, again, it limited the access of transgender students to facilities. But APS held the line at that point, and we reiterated the commitment that was stated in 2016 by supporting transgender students in working with families to ensure that there were plans of support for prohibiting gender discrimination and that students would have access to facilities based upon gender identity and expression. And I see someone in the chat saying that they're proud of APS, but it's very true. When other districts around the country were folding, APS stood with our transgendered families, our non-binary students, and students who are transitioning to ensure that they still had protections and access to facilities. So in 2020, this is actually when the ruling in the Adams case came out, the initial ruling that ultimately, the initial ruling allowed students to access facilities based upon their gender identity. So at that point, the General Counsel for APS again noted the practice to allow students to utilize the restroom that are in alignment with their identity. And at that point, when Adams was first ruled upon, that actually brings us to where we are now. And most recently, our district restated our commitments to transgender students as recent as January 26th of last year, based upon a recent executive order from the Biden administration, which was an executive order which prevented discrimination based on gender identity. And so someone in the chat just asked, could we expand upon it? So basically, our stance as a district is that we allow students to utilize facilities based on their gender identity and their lived gender identities. And ultimately, we'll talk a little bit more about how we can go about doing that and how we facilitate communication, support, and dialogue related to gender identity and facilities used by transgendered students.
All right, and so just to unpack a little bit of what Deirdre just laid out for us related to district guidance and alignment with federal requirements. So what does this mean on the ground? So students should be allowed to use restroom or facilities aligned with their gender identity. Second, unisex or gender neutral restrooms may be an alternative option if desired by the student, but that is key, right? If desired by the student. Transgender or non-binary students should not be required to use gender neutral facilities if this goes against their perception of their gender identity. And last, communication with the student and guardians, if appropriate, is key to developing clear and consistent protocols for school supports, right? And so as you're thinking about laying out those plans, it really is critical to try and bring the parent and the student together so that there can be consistent and clear understanding about the position of the school and being able to support that student and make sure that that understanding is clear across the family as well as for all involved at the level of the school. Next, so APS also has an LGBTQI A plus, so many letters, task force. And some of the conclusions and recommendations developed from the 2020 and 2021 task force are below. So support for student organizations or gender sexuality alliances or GSAs. There are currently only 5 of these present across the APS schools. The development of inclusive curriculum offerings and trainings for staff, as well as an increase in mental health and wraparound supports. There was also a recommendation related to increasing partnerships with community organizations and LGBTQIA+ supporters. And lastly, creating strategies to help enhance family engagement and support structures.
And so what we'd like to talk about now are the equity-focused considerations and recommendations, many of which are aligned with the LGBTQIA+ task force recommendations that were developed within the district in 2020, 2021. But with the inception of the CESJ, we've delved a little bit more deeply into maximizing and enhancing some of the recommendations. So from an equity-focused lens, we are recommending that there's an adoption of a district-wide gender-affirming policy and protocol for all facilities. So beyond just restrooms, we need to look at locker rooms, dressing rooms, and any other facilities in which a student might be required to choose a restroom facility and determine how we can, as a district, support transgender and non-binary students in feeling comfortable in utilizing those spaces. We also recommend adoption of gender support plans. You may have heard those referred to as GSPs, but these are support plans, and Quentin will talk a little bit more about those next, to assure that there are privacies and protections, but as well as a detailed plan for how to meet the needs of transgender and gender nonconforming students. That we enhance training and technical assistance. So the first step is training and technical assistance for all leaders, much like what you're receiving today, to support the adoption of any new policies or amended policies related to gender and facilities use. And then expanded creation of the student alliances for APS schools so that we have more than just 5 active alliances, but that in actuality, they have the opportunity to be formed at all schools, as well as continued engagement of the LGBTQIA task force in leading the charge for exploring these policies and procedures. And then an annual dissemination and training of leaders and staff related to any written templates, protocols, procedures, or publications related to gender affirming protocols that were referenced earlier on the slide.
And so just a little bit more about those gender affirming protocols or gender support plans. So what these actually look like, these are a confidential document that is a template used for clarifying the needs of transgender, non-binary, or transitioning students. These are completed by the student in collaboration with school staff and caregivers, if appropriate, to again create a shared understanding of how the students' gender choices will be accounted for, recognized, and supported at the level of their school. And lastly, these can be used in conjunction with a gender communication plan. And so what that is a document that details the student's plan for formally communicating gender changes at their school.
And so talking a little bit more about the equity focused recommendations and how as the equity team and as we consider equity at the forefront of the work within our district, how do we prepare and collaborate? And so one of the things that we recommend is that APS, any APS guidance continues to align with federal anti-discrimination policies and legal guidance related to gender and facilities use. And then as a next step, that the district convene a working group so that that working group can craft and draft a concrete policy related to providing clear instructions to district administrators. So we have identified a few potential collaborators that are listed on the right side of the slide, again, referencing the LGBTQIA+ task force as being at the forefront of leading this work. Our federal programs team, who are experts in considering federal policies and the implications of compliance with those policies upon the school district as a whole. Our legal and policy division, so we talked about the general counsel's office and Erica Long, policy office, but ensuring that they're at the table, in addition to our facilities office and department, to make sure that they are aware of the implications of developing policies that are clear for students in their use of restrooms, locker rooms, and other facilities. Student advocacy groups, as well as Go Team representatives, will also be critical as we create working groups and conversation clusters around this topic.
All right, and so we know that we have provided you all with a lot of information this morning, and so now we would like to give everyone an opportunity to break out into a collaborative discussion session. I am going to place in the chat, and do not click it, I'm just placing it right now. I will give you instructions and let you know when to click the button. But I'm placing in the chat a link to a Google Drive folder that has 10 breakout rooms in it. Inside those breakout groups, there is the presentation that you just saw, as well as a note catcher, as well as a scenario related to a gender facilities related issue. And instructions for the entire activity. Once you go into the breakout rooms, you will nominate a note taker, a reporter, and a reader. The reader will read out the scenario to everyone, just so it'll be for the sake of time and for brevity. You review the included practice-based case study and review this independently, and then come back together and collectively answer the 4 questions in the group discussion file. Whoever our note taker is, each room has their own note taker file, and if you could please take the notes from your group, just high-level discussion right into that file, and we'll take those back into consideration as we think about how to continue supporting schools schools as it relates to these issues. And in 15 minutes, we'll all come back to the main room and we'll ask, based on our time, we'll ask a few groups to share out some of the key takeaways. Any questions? All right. And so if I could get I'm not sure who the host is, but if I could get someone to create 10 breakout rooms, and for our guests, as you enter the rooms, you'll be placed into the rooms anonymously, and you'll see the number of your room. Please match the number of your room with the number of the folder inside of the Google Chat file that I've just placed in the chat. I'm not sure who the host is.
I'm actually creating them, Quentin.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, perfect.
Alrighty, so everyone, you should see that there are 10 rooms available now. And if you would go ahead and join your room. And as I said, click the Google chat in the bottom and it will take you, you'll find all of your instructions and everything that you need to participate in the activity inside of your group's numbered folder.
Hello, Quentin. My name is Heidi. I'm getting ready to transition to the breakout.
Okay.
I did put a question in the chat that I would like someone to respond to before the end of our time together.
Perfect. Thank you. I thank you for calling our attention to that. If you go ahead into the group, we will make sure to answer that question when we come back together. Thank you for pointing it out for us.
Thank you.
And Quentin?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I was put out, I lost connection and I was kicked out of my room. Could someone add me back, please?
You should be able, do you see the breakout rooms at the bottom? You should be able to just go back in. If not, I will ask, was it Ms. Collier? me see. Do you remember which room you were in?
Yes. I want to say it was 5. 5.
5. Let's see. I feel like you should be able to. Do you see it?
Yes, I see it now.
I don't think I couldn't hear or see anyone in my breakout room. It was
Who
group
am I speaking
6.
to?
Oh, you can't see me?
Is it
Stacy
Stacy
Joseph.
Let me see.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I didn't know how come you can't see me.
No,
My camera's on.
I can. Well, I can see your box now, but I can't. I see like the APS background, but not your your
Not my
face or
face?
anything.
Oh.
So it says that you're in room 6. Let's see.
Yeah. Nothing happened in room 6?
There are. Okay, I'm gonna try and move you. Do you see something pop up?
Yeah. Room
Okay.
2 now.
Well, let's just try that one.
Okay, thank you.
All right. And so welcome back. I think pretty much everybody's been able to come back into our main room now. And so if we could just we'd like to hear a bit just to hear from a few groups. We don't have much time left, only about 5 minutes. And I know Deirdre has wanted to answer one of the questions that was left in the chat for us. But if we could just get a few groups to share out just something that you took away from your group's conversation. And maybe I'll start with group one, just to get us going.
We had a really good discussion. The last statement that someone made was really great, like creating a support system that's inclusive and doesn't isolate students. And then our concern was how to make it so that our transgender students or the students using the restroom aren't, like, how we want to protect those students where other students aren't abusing what's happening and going into the restroom for the wrong purpose. So that was something that we talked about, not isolating those students, but also making it so that other students don't abuse the rule, I guess is a good way to put it.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. That's a very real concern, I know, for many of our school leaders. Thank you so much. What about group 4? Let me hear from somebody in group 4. Or any of the other groups? Anyone who might like to share out before I pass it over to Deirdre?
Well, group 10, we looked at making sure that, like Ms. Wilson said, those children are accommodated, but we also looked at the fact that they're going to have to be accommodated because parents might feel that they're being discriminated against. And Mr. Tanks shared that, you know, what about the use of the facility? Are we going to be able to have enough people to monitor those gender, I forgot that term, the gender usage of the bathroom. So it's a lot of things that we're going to have to look at holistically as a district to make sure that all these policies and procedures are put into place so that everybody is protected and respected.
Thank you so much for that, Ms. Settles. I appreciate that. And now I'll pass it over to Deirdre to close us out. And so sorry for everybody about the time. I know that there was a lot to get through in just a short amount of time.
Oh, yes. So thank you so much, everybody, for engaging. I think that this was initially a springboard for us to have discussion, but we want to let you know that first and foremost, we understand that these are new policies and procedures that many of us are just, faced with for the first time as we work with students and their ability to feel safe with their gender identities. And so someone else mentioned earlier, support is key. So the first thing is, as transgender students identify themselves, one, understanding that those gender support plans that we discussed, those are things that can help you to facilitate and navigate the overall ability of transgender students to feel, or non-binary or transitioning students to feel comfortable. There was an earlier question in the chat where someone asked, well, how do we go about, is there a policy related to gender pronouns and parents being aware? So the first thing you want to focus in on is the student's desire and what is in the best interest of the student. So if a student comes to you and says that their family is not in agreement with their decisions, or that they feel as though they might not be accepted if they were to share that, we ask that you understand and respect the student's wishes first. And then again, if there is further discussion and counseling around the student wanting to develop a gender support plan, that gender support plan is something you engage with the student first, and if safe, integrate the family in. And then with regard to facilities, this is where a lot of the recommendations from the equity division are being made, so that as a district, we can begin to plan and strategically think about, do we have unisex bathrooms as an option that don't necessarily segregate transgender students, but allow students generally who might want to use a unisex bathroom to use it? So that's something that is being considered and recommended. I know that we are at a time boundary, but we would like to answer any more questions. The information that we have today our presentation is linked within the resources. There are some live links within the presentation, within the slide deck, to templates for gender support plans, to templates for GSAs, to resources. So Quentin, I'll ask you to advance the slides. We have about 30 more seconds. But just the first thing is that these are some recommended resources. So these are all live links to resources, to information about some of the advocacy agencies. And if you'll go back one more slide, Quentin, these are live links to allies and agencies, just so that you can educate yourself more to the information about LGBTQIA youth, gender use in facility, as well as what the U.S. Department of Education and the district is doing, and Lambda Legal, which is the preeminent legal resource. And then again, feel free through the slide presentations and resources from today's conference. This presentation is already uploaded for you to access. And then you can always contact the Center for Equity and Social Justice, Quentin, myself, as well as our colleague, Gina DeVoe, who works as the coordinator for equitable student supports. And as someone said in the chat, the presentation is available via the conference website. So we'd just like to thank you for your engagement, your attentiveness, and your participation today. Feel free to reach out to us. And again, we appreciate your flexibility, knowing that we were at a time boundary, but thank you so much. And we look forward to working with you and collaborating on these issues as we move forward. Have a wonderful rest of the week and enjoy the last session of today's PL.